So last Sunday, if you were with us, you will know we started a new teaching series, and we're doing something a little bit different. We've got including today, we've got 3 more Sundays in this space. And so we're doing something a little bit different. Normally, when we teach a sermon series, we would, pick a topic or a theme, or we might sort of teach through a whole book of the Bible. But instead, with this series, we're doing something a little bit different. We're diving into the life of a New Testament character. And we're exploring the kind of different moments that this guy called Peter had when he encountered Jesus. And just thinking about the impact that Jesus had on his life and what that might mean to us. So who was Peter? As I said last time, Peter was one of the 12 disciples. He's often the disciple, I think, that most of us can identify with. He is often seen as being quite outspoken. You get the impression that he often speaks before he thinks. Often he says things that aren't quite right. He kind of misses the mark a little bit. He's kind of misguided in some of the things that he says. But actually, that's also a quality of Peter. He's that person in your life who often says things and asks the questions you wished you asked. It's just you wasn't brave enough to say them, and he was. And so last week, we looked briefly at the fact that Peter wasn't always called Peter. He was actually called Simon. And Simon was a fisherman. And actually, it's Jesus who renames him Peter. And that name Peter we get from an Aramaic word, which is Cephas. And that literally means rock or stone. And last week we looked at one of Peter's first encounters with Jesus. And at the end of that encounter, we see that Peter, along with a bunch of his friends, they lay down their trade as fishermen. They put down their nets and they give everything up to follow Jesus. Last week, Jesus was getting into Peter's fishing boat. And this week, we're going to look at another event that took place in a boat. So if you've got a Bible, we're going to be in Matthew 14. Always really good to bring a Bible to church. And if I would say a real one, I know you can have a Bible on your phone and I've got it on my iPad, but it's not a real Bible, is it? It's we're going to be in Matthew 14. Just to put the verses that we're going to look at into some context, Jesus, with the help of the disciples, has just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So this miraculous multiplication of food has taken place. And then we see, as was often the case with Jesus, after he's been around large crowds, he wants to withdraw. And we see this kind of rhythm throughout the Gospels of Jesus engaging in public ministry and then withdrawing. Jesus has this outward existence, but then he also has this inward existence as well. So this is where we pick up in verse 22 of Matthew 14. And so it says this: immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, whilst he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the winds, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you, Peter replied. Tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. There was a psychologist by the name of Frank Farley, and he spent much of his career studying what he referred to as the T-type personality. And a T-type personality are kind of like the thrill seekers, the base jumpers, those people who kind of jump from one building to the next, or, they chuck themselves out of aeroplanes. The kind of people who love to take risks. He theorizes that T-type personalities require an increased level of stimulation to maintain their energy. Now, I don't know how many T-type personalities we've got in the room. Anybody willing to admit I'm a T-type? Anyone chuck themselves out of a plane or, done a bungee jump? No. As I expected, my assumption was that most of us aren't the T-type personality. I'm not sure what you call that. Maybe you call it the non-T-type. So most of us in this room would be a non-T-type person. And the truth is that our culture leans towards being a non-T-type person. Because actually, culturally, I don't know if you've noticed, we've become quite risk averse, haven't we? And, I'm not sure if you've noticed, particularly in different things that go on around us. If I think back to when I was a child, which seems a long time ago now, I'm a very proud Gen Xer. Any more Gen Xers in the room? Woo! Not like the boomers on the front row, but I'm a proud Gen Xer, which means I'm also a latchkey kid. It means that both my parents worked and I had to let myself in when I got home from school. There was no after school care. There was none of that sort of thing. You let yourself in and did your own thing. And that's completely different to parenting nowadays. And you can judge whether you think that's good or bad. Or take, for example, like children's play areas. I remember a children's play area was a few metal bars and a concrete floor. It wasn't any of this kind of like bouncy floor rubbish. You know what I mean? If you fell off, you did break a bone. And so we have got this tendency to make things more comfortable. I remember like being, 4 or 5 years of age and you didn't have to wear a seatbelt in the car. Anybody remember that? And I remember being 4 or 5 years of age and sitting in the front seat with my dad thinking how cool it is sitting in the front of the car and him having to brake really hard in the car, me flying forward, hitting my head on the dashboard and knocking myself out. And so, you can see why in our culture now that we have become somewhat risk averse. But what I've noticed is that in a culture that carries this level of risk aversion, that those of us who follow Jesus can carry the same risk aversion mentality into our relationship with him. And so there's no wonder that some people find Christians quite boring. No wonder even those who do follow Jesus find their thrills somewhere or in something else. But what if following Jesus was meant to be this thrilling, exhilarating experience? Something that pulled us out of our comfort zone? What if following Jesus made our hearts beat just that little bit faster? What if following Jesus made the hairs on the back of your head stand on end? What if following Jesus wasn't always safe and predictable, but actually sometimes a little bit unpredictable, or maybe even a little bit dangerous? Now, this passage starts with two really important life lessons. The first is in verse 22. It says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, whilst he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed them, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. As I said at the start, Jesus often withdrew from the crowds, withdrew from his closest friends to be alone with God the Father. And you see, Jesus continually modeled this rhythm of activity and rest, showing us that there's time to be productive and fruitful, and there's time to stop and abide. Jesus models to us over and over again what it looks like to care for our souls. And so that's the first lesson we see in the opening verses of this passage. The second lesson is this, maybe a little bit less obvious, but verse 24, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And I think what we see here is a picture of life in the real world. You see, there is this lie that you and I have been told that says the goal of life is that everything should be easy. Everything should just run smoothly, that somehow real life should be a breeze. And what we see in these disciples and what we're reminded again in this story is that real life, there will be times when the wind is against us. In real life, there'll be times when it just feels like hard work, when we're buffeted by the things that surround us. Maybe you're here today and right now, your life is up against the wind. Maybe you're experiencing pressure from all kinds of angles. The wind is in your face. Maybe that's in the context of your family, or your finances, or your job, or your relationships. And you see, one of the things that the Bible constantly reminds us of is that it's super honest about the human experience, isn't it? You know, as we read through the scriptures, it's this continued pattern that is revealed to us that actually our human experience is normal. Some of the things we experience, some of the pain that we go through is normal. And so there's two lessons that we see in the opening portion of this passage. But despite those two important lessons, I want to focus our time on the rest of the passage. You see, in this passage, Peter discovers the thrill of following Jesus. Peter was willing to take a risk, to be pushed outside of his comfort zone, and to walk on water. You know, Jesus was the most revolutionary person in history. He did some amazing, mind-blowing things. In fact, the Gospel of John tells us that there wasn't enough space to document all the things that Jesus did. But Jesus also said, as his followers, as his disciples, we get to do the things he did. In fact, he said, greater things you will do. And so when we think about what it means to follow Jesus, then surely it must be more than showing up here on a Sunday and perhaps remembering to go to your city group in the week. It must be more than that. Surely the adventure of following Jesus is greater than just showing up to meetings. And we see in Peter and in the life that he had in Jesus that it was something that was quite exhilarating, something that was an adventure. It was a life that pushed him outside of his comfort, that being with Jesus wasn't always safe. There were times when I imagine where he and the other disciples, they had to take a deep breath and go, okay, let's do this. Let's follow him. And so if we're going to learn something from Peter this week, I think we need to ask ourselves 4 important questions as we walk through this passage together. And so the first question is this: what is your comfort zone? What is your comfort zone? Verse 25, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried for fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. And then Peter, he steps out of the boat. He walks on the water and comes towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, Lord, save me. John Ortberg wrote a wonderful book based on this passage of scripture. Some of you may have read it. It was called, If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat. If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out on the boat. And you see, for Peter, his comfort zone was the boat. Who was Peter before he met Jesus? He was a fisherman, wasn't he? He would have experienced the safety and understood how to be safe on a boat. And so Peter's comfort zone was the boat. John Ortberg says this. He says, I believe there is someone inside us who tells us there is more to life than sitting in the boat. You were made for something more than merely avoiding failure. There's something inside you that wants to walk on water, to leave the comfort of routine existence and abandon yourself to the high adventure of following God. So let me ask you a very important question. What's your boat? Your boat is whatever represents safety and insecurity to you apart from God himself. Your boat is whatever you're tempted to put your trust in, especially when life gets a little stormy. Your boat is whatever keeps you so comfortable that you don't want to give it up, even if it's keeping you from joining Jesus on the waves. Your boat is whatever pulls you away from the high adventure, and I love this, of extreme discipleship. All our comfort zones, all our boats are different. For many of us, our boat, our comfort zone, our security may be found in financial security. Some of us may be wrestling with a sense of calling from God, maybe into some kind of ministry or mission, or maybe working for a charity, doing something we feel would make a real difference in the world. But the thought of stepping out of the boat and risking our financial security, it scares us to death. For some of us, our boat may be our job. Now, we may hate our job, but we are so afraid of stepping out and leaving the security of that job we hate, we fail to ever find true fulfillment. For some of us, our boat may be a relationship, maybe a close friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, maybe a spouse. And in that relationship, we see some obvious problems. Maybe it's something they do or the way they treat us. But this relationship is our boat. And if we get out of that boat, will there be anyone or anything else for us? And so even though that relationship makes us unhappy, we stay in the boat. We settle for comfort. For some of us, our boat is other people's opinions. We know we need to do something. We know God has said this, but we hold back because, after all, what would my family say? Or what would my friends think? And so we stay seated in our boat and never take that step. Maybe for some of us, other people's opinion is what's stopping us fully surrendering to Jesus. Time and time again, we felt him calling us, inviting us to follow him, but we stay in our boats. And so, do we know what our boat is? Do we know what represents our safety and security apart from God himself? Are we aware of what keeps us from venturing out and what prevents us from discovering the thrill and exhilaration of following Jesus? You see, sitting in the boat is the reason why our life with Jesus can seem dull and boring and predictable. As John Ortberg says, if you want to walk on water, if you want to go on an adventure with Jesus, if you want to do the things that he did, you've got to get out of the boat. Second question is this. In a kind of risk aversion culture, can we really avoid risk? Can we really avoid risk? So, as we've discovered, there's no T types in the room. But can we really arrange our lives in such a way that we avoid risk completely? Now, we all try, don't we, to avoid risk, and probably for sensible reasons. You know, we don't necessarily want broken bones or even worse, fatality. And, and so often we can read the statistics, can't we, of, what are we against if we're trying to kind of eliminate risk from our lives? Do you know that actually lightning kills about 10,000 people every year? And so when it's thundering and lightning, it's a good idea, isn't it, to kind of like put your trainers on and stay in the house, because, I could be one of those 10,000 people. And so it is sensible to avoid risk. Anyone here afraid of flying? Anybody got a fear of flying? One or two of you? And again, that could be justifiable. But if you think about all the people that fly, it's only 1,200 people a year who lose their life in an aeroplane-related incident. And so what's the chances, of you being one of those 1,200 people? And just to put it in perspective, 2,900 people a year are killed by a hippopotamus. And so, you've got more chance of being killed by a hippo than falling out of the sky in an aeroplane. And so you might think, okay, I'm just going to avoid large animals. I'll just avoid hippos, But then at least 30 people a year are killed by ants. Can you believe it? 30 people a year die as a result of ants. Tammy is now panicking because we have an ant problem. And so we might think, well, what, I'll just stay indoors. I won't go into the wild. There's no hippos, there's no ants. I'm just going to stay indoors. Do you know that 13 people a year are killed by vending machines? And that isn't because you've eaten the content of the vending machine, but 13 people a year killed by vending machines. Who knew? And so as non-T-type personalities, that's it. We might think, I'm just not going to leave the house. I'm just going to stay at home. I won't touch anything. I'm just going to have a bath. You know that 340 people a year die in the bath. That's crazy, isn't it? 340 people a year die in the bath. And you think, okay, I'm just going to stay in bed. But the problem is 450 people die falling out of bed. I think you get the picture. As much as we try and avoid risk, there's always a risk to be had. In an uncertain world, it's risky. You know, life is risky every single day. John Wimber, who was the founder of our family of churches and really the person responsible for giving birth to us as a movement of churches, his most famous statement is this: faith is spelt R-I-S-K. Faith is spelt risk. So what does it mean to risk for you? What part of your walk with Jesus do you need to take some new risks? I come across this interview with John Wimber where he said this. He says, "When I became a Christian, I was a musician with 2 albums I had produced in the US top 10. John Wimber was the producer of the Righteous Brothers. He had all sorts of accolades. He could play hundreds of instruments. And he said, it was the establishment of my career after 13 years of hard work. But God spoke to me in the 2-line parable of the pearl of great price. I want it. Give it to me. He didn't say, give it to me, and then I'll give you a career as a pastor or a music ministry that will go around the nations of the world. He said, give everything, liquidate all your assets, and I'll give you the pearl. You see, that pearl wasn't a career. That pearl was Jesus. And you see, when we choose to take risks, it's because we're going for the greatest prize of all, and that's Jesus himself. Are we willing to risk it all for him? So what's our comfort zone? What's our boat? Can we really avoid risk? Here's the third question. Do you know you're called? Do you know you're called? Now, sometimes we can be inclined, can't we, to just jump out of the boat. But it might not be the wisest thing to do. And we can have this kind of gung-ho sort of attitude where we just think, you know what, I'm just going to chuck my career away and God's going to provide for the rest. You know, we can have that kind of mentality. But I love what Peter says in verse 28. He says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. You see, before we jump out of the boat, we need to find out if this is just us. You know, is it just because I ate too much pizza last night and I'm feeling a little bit funky? Or, Jesus, is this really you? Are you speaking? One of the reasons we have to be sure is because we live in a culture that calls us to constantly chase after the latest and greatest thing. And sometimes we can go for the latest and greatest thing and it be totally the wrong thing to do. And actually, I think the risk in those moments is to actually stay where you are and to step out of the boat. You see, all our risks turn on what God is saying to us. So are we being called? Jesus, is this you? That should be our question. And so what is Jesus saying to you? What's he whispering into your ear? Apply for the assistant pastor role. Will you be like Peter and step out of the boat knowing that Jesus is the one who's leading you? Lord, if it's you, tell me to come on the water. And then our final question, as we learn from Peter, as we attempt to put this adventure back into our pursuit of Jesus, our last question has to be, where is your focus? Where is your focus? Verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, Lord, save me. At the beginning of this moment where Peter gets out of the boat, I imagine he was like fixated on Jesus, like, this better work, Jesus, this better work. And I imagine he was looking at Jesus. He's like, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. But then something happens. He takes his eyes off Jesus. He begins to focus on what's going on around him. And when he sees the size of the waves and the wind, he's frightened and he begins to sink. His faith is overcome. And when we step out of our boats, when we step out of our comfort zones, we can do so with the best of intentions. We can all start with the best intentions. Yes, Lord, I'm going to get out of my boat. I'm going to risk. I know you're calling me. I know what you've confirmed. I know it's your voice. I know what you've said. But here's the truth. Just because we're called doesn't mean the walk is going to be easy. Let me say that again. Just because we're called doesn't mean the walk is going to be easy. And often our steps of faith are tested when we take the first few steps, aren't they? They're tested in those early moments. As some of you know, one of the jobs that I have is to coach and mentor those in our movement who are going to go and plant churches across the UK and Ireland and prepare them for this adventure of church planting. And the thing that we have to drum into all our church planters is that you need to know that you know that you know you are called. Yeah? You really need to know that you know that you know you are called to do this. You're called to go on this crazy adventure of planting a church. And the reason they need to know that they need to know that they need to know that they're called to do this is because there are going to be times and moments when they don't think that is true. There's going to be times and moments when the wind is going to be against them, when there's going to be all sorts of storms and disappointments, where they need to remind themselves, but Jesus, you called us to do this. Jesus, you called me into this. You got me into this mess. See, whenever we take a risk with Jesus, the issue should never be how big are the problems we're facing. The issue should always be how big is God? How big is God? The issue is never how much am I able to do? The issue is always what could Jesus do through me? What could Jesus do through me if I obey his call and fully surrender to him? Keep my face turned towards him. You see, we see in Peter someone who experienced the thrill of seeking Jesus and seeing Jesus working and through him. And I imagine it's in ways that he never could have imagined. One day Peter is fishing in a boat and as we saw last week, not particularly successfully. One day he's fishing in a boat and the next he's walking on water. Lots of people dismiss Peter, don't they? They said, he gets out of the boat and he walks on water, and then he failed. He got out the boat. He got out of the boat. He walked on water. And if we're to take Peter's example, you and I need to be willing to get out of our boats. We need to be willing to take a risk and discover the joy of what it means to really follow Jesus on this crazy adventure. Because I think sometimes we forget that this is an adventure. It's an adventure of the lifetime, following Jesus into all the spaces and places that he ends up in. And I think sometimes we think, I did my bit on Sunday and I'm extra holy, so I went to a group in the week and I've ticked my box. But Jesus has got a much bigger adventure for us than that. There's way more. There's way more he wants to offer us. Way more he wants to give us. Way more that he wants to call us into. Amen? Why don't we stand and we'll quickly pray.